everybody and welcome to the final instalment of this year's Mystery Blanket Club. Can you believe it? We are now about to begin Mail Out 10, which means it's the final piece of the puzzle being revealed, and I am going to talk to you in this blog today about the theme, the inspiration for this year's Mystery Blanket. All will be revealed today. Now I'm sitting here wrapped up in my very snugly warm blanket, and hopefully you will be doing the same very, very soon. If you have managed to keep up with your squares each month, then you will be about to begin your final mail out 10 today, 4 squares and the edging to complete your blanket. Now, if you haven't managed to keep up month by month, then please don't panic. It's not a rush to the finishing line. There's no prize for who finishes first. This is an enjoyable experience, something to savour, something to really enjoy. So all the technical information, all those vids, all the blogs will remain on the website for a very long time. They will be there for you to go and access whenever you need them. And all I hope is that you've enjoyed the experience and that you will continue to enjoy the experience right through to the very end. In this blog, I'm going to focus on talking to you about the theme of the blanket, the inspiration, how the design came about. So if you do need any help or support or advice about the squares you're knitting this month, please do remember to read the written blog. After this introduction, there's lots and lots of tips and advice about the squares you're knitting, which will help you right through to the end of the project. Okay, so now it's time to reveal the theme of this year's mystery blanket. If you haven't already guessed it, or you've kept that little coloured envelope shut tight right into this point, now the mystery is over. The title of this year's mystery blanket is The Enchanted Forest. What I absolutely love about living in the UK is that we have very definite seasons, our spring, summer, autumn and winter. And without doubt, my favourite of those seasons has to be autumn. I just love the season of autumn, the season that we're in now. The scenery is just amazing as the leaves are starting to turn. There are just amazing colours out there all around us in our natural surroundings. Now, I've decided to focus on the idea of a forest, and not just any forest, but an enchanted forest. And I just love the kind of idea of having all that magic and surrealism within a forest. So in the design, I focused on animals and plants. There's lots of intarsia picture knits in there, some Fairisles, and also there's all those textured stitches too, trying to interpret the enchanted forest through knitting. So where does the design start? Well, the design starts with the inspiration. Without inspiration, you haven't got a design. So at the beginning of the design process, I gather together all sorts of images related to the theme. And there's lots of different places that I go to for reference. I found a whole load of wonderful gardening magazines with fabulous images and pictures of autumn, of leaves, of landscapes, of gardens, some super pictures. I go out and I take photographs. Your camera is the best thing. Mobile phones with those wonderful cameras they have now, just the best thing for going out and taking pictures of the scenery. A great way to capture some really good inspiration. I collect greetings cards. I've got a huge stash of greetings cards. Fabulous for inspiration for all sorts of projects. And one card in particular I used for the colour palette to help me create the colour palette. So this is the card. I can't remember where I bought it some time ago. Just absolutely love the colours in this card, especially all those sort of tealy colours in there. And I use this very much for the colour inspiration, combined with what I was seeing in all the images that I gathered together related to the subject of autumn. Yarn selection is really, really important. It's important that the yarns that I choose work together well in the patterns that I'm designing, and that they have a good drape too. And also I need specific colours. Once I've got my colour palette together, I need specific colours. So having my yarn made by Laxton's is an absolute dream, because what it means is that I can take to them the palette of colours that I want for the blanket, and basically they make them for me, so I can have exactly the shades that I want. I absolutely love combining my own yarn with Rowan yarn. Rowan has, for many, many years, since I was a child, been my favourite yarn to work with. And in this blanket, I chose to combine my light wool DK with Rowan felted tweed, Rowan soft yak and alpaca soft. 3 of my most favourite Rowan yarns, and they work so well with the light merino DK, especially in the Fairisles patterns and in the Intarsia patterns too. They just work so well together. So I selected my yarns, had my inspiration, had my colour palette, selected my yarns, and then it was time to start planning out the design. One other thing I do at the beginning of a project, of the blanket project in particular, because it's such a huge project and there's such a lot of design work in it, I look at my theme and alongside the images, I write down all the words I can think of that relate to that subject. So I go online, look at thesaurus, look through the dictionary, look through books and magazines, picking out words that relate. I work very well with language, so words conjure up lots of different images to me, and they're great. It's a great way as well of building up a sort of vocabulary of words that I can use for the titles of the squares. Okay, so one of the first things that I do is I create a colour layout for the whole blanket. Now, it's important to say that this is just an initial kind of colour layout. It does change over time. This is what I drew up at the very beginning of the project, just to give me an idea of where the colours were going, how they were going to work together, and most importantly to give me some idea of yarn quantities, how much of each colour would be needed for the design. I decided to have the squares all in one direction. In last year's project, Deco Dreams, some of the squares were turned on their side, and the same I think happened in 1001 Nights. The squares were rotated around. They weren't all in the correct. They weren't all in the same direction. But in this blanket, all the squares are in the same direction, and it makes it so much easier actually to sew everything together at the end. If you haven't made a start yet on sewing strips together, having the squares in one direction makes it a lot easier. So it wasn't too difficult to actually assemble all the strips and put the whole thing together. Now, another thing I work on alongside the colour layout is the positioning of the squares, where all those different patterns are going to go. And I take quite a bit of time over making sure that the balance of those squares are right, that they are harmonious when you look at them. For example, I would never have, or rarely, I don't think I've ever had, 2 vertical patterns next door to each other. They would always be between a horizontal pattern or maybe a pitch knit, an intarsia square. So I take a lot of time over that, just making sure things are placed in the right position. Again, this isn't a final, this is how it's definitely going to be plan. It does change over time, but it just gives me an idea of how many picture knits are going into the blanket, how many Fairisles, how many horizontal patterns, how many vertical patterns. The balance between these squares has to be right, so the plan is really important. So I'm going to talk to you now about some of the squares in the blanket, beginning with the textured knits. There's a lot of textured knits in this blanket, and it's something which I absolutely love. I love combining together colour and stitch structure and beads, and just see what happens when, you know, what comes off the needles when you start combining all those things together. It's great fun. I love that experimentation process, and the result of that experimentation are the squares in this year's blanket. So let's look first of all at Thicket. Thicket was a lace and bead square which you had very early on in the project. And what I really liked about this lace stitch structure was the sort of spikiness that it created, a reflection really of the spiky bushes in the enchanted forest. So you can see in the lace pattern, the stitches are swerving from one way to the other quite sharply across the work. And I did this in 2 different colourways. Bracken was a 3-colour, 3-stripe rotation, a really interesting stitch this, and I know that a lot of you wrote to me during the project to say how much you were enjoying this particular stitch. I mean, the colour combinations that you could put together for this are really endless. It's a really good stitch to experiment with colour, and in this blanket there were 4 different variations of this stitch. It transformed into Bluebells further later on in the project, but you've got two colorways using the greens and the browns. It changed to the browns and the elfin color further up to give you those different colorways. A really interesting stitch and great fun to knit. Foliage is another lace stitch. This time it focuses on sort of exaggerated large leaf shapes. Again, I was really interested in how the stitches could create these wonderful sort of soft flowing shapes resembling leaves. And there's some beads in there, of course, just to give it that extra sparkle, knitted in 2 different colourways in this blanket. Forager is one of my horizontal stitch patterns. This is the square that has the horizontal stripes with some exaggerated pearl stitch running through it, just to give it that extra interest. And for this square, I just put together a really lovely collection of colours from the palette with that added texture with that pearl stitch. Quite simple to knit, but interesting too, with that sort of added detail. And I did this in 2 different colourways. There are 3 cable patterns in the blanket: Vines, Chestnuts and Goblin. Now, cables are a stitch structure which I absolutely love to experiment with. What I love about cables is that you can create so many different cable patterns just by changing the direction of the twist of the cable, the number of rows between the cable twists, the stitches that are in the cable, the stitches that are between the cables, and of course adding in beads too and bobbles adds a whole new dimension to them. So the first cable that you had way back, I think in the very first mail out, was Chestnuts. So in this square I was trying to interpret the shape of chestnuts, the look of a chestnut in this cable pattern. So they're quite circular shapes with those contrast coloured bobbles knitted in. So Vines is a quite complicated looking cable pattern, but I've been told it was very enjoyable to knit. So I hope that you did enjoy knitting this pattern. But the cable twists are kind of quite round. Well, they're not random, they are in a pattern, but they twist sort of back and forth, and the cables in between each other are kind of staggered. So you get quite a complicated looking cable pattern. And in this, I was trying to represent all the twisted kind of vines that you would find in the enchanted forest. In Goblin, now the title is self-explanatory. It's my Goblin square, lovely bright pumpkin orange. In this enchanted forest, there are some surreal characters. There are fairies, there are imps, there are elves, there are pixies, there are nixies, and there are goblins too. So this is a square to represent that naughty little character, the Goblin, in the Enchanted Forest. So let's move on and look at the Fairisles patterns. Obviously this was for option 1. For option 2, these were changed into sort of stripe patterns instead. But for option 1, if you knitted the Fairisles patterns, the two main ones down the left and right hand sides are Hawthorn and Wolfsbane. So I was looking through my plant books and trying to find sort of poisonous plants that you might find in an enchanted forest, which you might want to avoid. Definitely don't eat those poisonous plants. This was Wolfsbane, the one with the purpley sort of colourway. I think there was mulberry, clay, and I think shadow in that one. And then you've got Hawthorn, based on a sort of prickly hawthorn bush. I don't think it's poisonous. However, it's certainly prickly, something that you definitely don't want to come into contact with. Then in the centre of the design, you have the butterfly squares, so those sort of very naive butterfly shapes in Fairisles. And on the top and bottom edges of the blanket, you've got your Elves and Imps and your Pixies and Nixies squares. So these squares were inspired by these little surreal characters in the Enchanted Forest, but interpreted in a sort of swirly kind of Fairisles design that looks like kind of foliage. So they were great fun to knit. I love combining Fairisles with stripes and with beads, and all these squares do that. They're all kind of based on the same kind of square, but changes to colours, changes to the Fairisles, and changes to the colours of the beads. So let's move on then and talk about the picture knits. Now there are 9 picture knits in this blanket. Of course, they were option 1. Option 2, in option 2, the picture knits were replaced with textured squares, striped squares, anything but intarsia in those option 2 squares. So let's have a look at all those 9 squares. You had toadstool, toadstools, wise old owl, frog, snail, dragonfly, deer, butterfly, and that centre square, Sly Fox. So for these picture knits, I looked at a lot of different resources for these. I sort of looked on the internet at different images of stylized animals. I found some wonderful pajama prints in a shop in Cambridge. Some wonderful pajama prints in autumnal colours with these wonderful foxes, these lovely fluid fox shapes printed onto the fabric. And I found inspiration in colouring books of all things, some lovely line drawings of stylised animals which really helped me to create some of the squares in this blanket. So there was lots of speculation about what the centre square would be, and now you know that the centre square is Sly Fox. Did you guess that right? I know that there were lots and lots of different ideas floating about. I did hear somebody say they thought it might be a unicorn or maybe a fairy, but I decided to keep all the picture knits, including that centre square, focused on a real creature rather than something fantastical. So you do have that element of the enchanted forest, the magic, the surrealism in those squares: Goblin, Elves and Imps, Pixies and Nixies. So they are there, they're there in the background, but in the foreground, in those very vivid, very striking picture knits, it's real creatures. I decided to make them all real. I did think about making the centre one a unicorn. That did cross my mind, unicorn. But in the end, I decided to stick with the fox. And foxes are one of my most favourite forest creatures. We get lots and lots of them here in the UK. Beautiful creatures, fabulous colours on their body and on their face. So with the creatures, I decided as well to show them partially, i.e. not the whole creature. And this was something that I thought might add to the kind of mystical, magical feel of the blanket. In other words, you can't see the whole creature, but you see most of it, but partly, some of it is partly out of the square, out of that perimeter of that 18 centimetre square. And that was sort of done on purpose rather than having the whole head or the whole animal. I just thought that would work better with this theme and give it a little bit more mystery too. Although you can see what the animal is, you can't see all of it. It's like it's hiding away in the enchanted forest, just partially seen as you're walking through the forest. So the edging then, your final part of the puzzle. I actually love picking up stitches. I know that might seem quite crazy, but I love picking up stitches. And I'll tell you one reason why I do love picking up stitches. It's because my edges of my knitting are lovely and neat. I take great care over making sure all the edges are neat, and that makes picking up stitches around the edges on those edge squares much easier to do. So you might look at that edging and think, oh my goodness, I'm picking up over 300 stitches along each edge. But if you use markers and things to mark out your squares, you know, there's advice in the blog about how to make that job easier. I will talk about that in the blog to you. And once you know where to put your needle, it's relatively straightforward to do. There's tech vids and things to help you as well, so do dip into those if you need that extra support. So with the edging, what I do with that is it's always obviously the last part that I design, and I never decide what the edging is going to be until the whole of the blanket is completed, because very often I then see something in the blanket, a stripe, a beaded pattern, maybe a textured pattern that I think, right, I'm going to use that in the edging. It's going to bring it all together, and that's really what I strive to do with the edging pattern. It's like it's the bringing together of all the squares. So the colour choice is important there. Obviously, I'm looking at what we have left after all those squares have been knitted, but I'm looking at the colours, and I'm looking also at the squares in the blanket and seeing if there's anything that I can take from a square and use that in the edging. And indeed, that beaded stripe comes from Deadly Nightshade and the Butterflies square, and then I've combined it with some garter stitch stripes. So there's two options there for the blanket for you to choose from. Well, two colourway options, but it will be dependent, the colours you use will be dependent on what you have left over. And if you've mixed your squares, you've mixed your options, then you'll just have to take a look at what you've got left, look at the yarns, look at the beads. You don't need to copy exactly the same colours that I've done. Choose your own colours if you so wish. Use what you've got left over. Or you can knit it exactly the same as I have. That's totally up to you. So when you've completed the edging and sewn in all those loose ends, you can sit back and enjoy your mystery blanket. Your mystery blanket knitting adventure for 2024 is over. And now you can admire your wonderful blanket, snuggle up in it, and let everybody admire all the hard work you've put in over the last 10 months. So we're at the end of this year's mystery blanket adventure, but how do you fancy a brand new adventure next year? You may have already signed up to next year's mystery blanket, and thank you so much if you have already grabbed yourself a membership. But if you haven't, there is still time to sign up. We close the doors on the Mystery Blanket Club on the 31st of December, or when the memberships sell out. They are limited again. We are selling out quite fast. We've got about 75 memberships left. So if you haven't grabbed yourself a membership, please nip across to our online shop today. Don't delay, grab yourself a membership. You can choose to pay in one go or split it over between 2 to 4 months if that suits you better. But once you've reserved your place, then you're in for next year, and the journey will start all over again on February the 1st. I want to finish by thanking all of you for being such amazing members. I have enjoyed so much hearing from you all, seeing your progress, listening to your comments. I've had some great feedback. All feedback is always welcome. It really, really helps us with future projects. It's been a fantastic year. I've enjoyed myself. I hope you have too. And I really hope that you decide to join me next year when the fun begins all over again with a brand new project. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the final instalment, and hopefully I'll see you next year. Bye-bye.